It is easy for many of us to take the thriving beaver population of Vermont for granted. However, actions taken by early pioneers in America decimated the beaver population beyond natural repair. Beavers were eventually reintroduced to Vermont, and they have since thrived, significantly altering their habitat and creating entirely new ecosystems. This is the story of the beaver, their past and present, and why they are so very important to our natural world. Today, finding signs of beavers is quite simple. The ancient mountains of Vermont are thickly forested and dotted throughout with beaver ponds. The beauty and pristine of Vermont seems so timeless, it can be hard to imagine that it was ever any different. But sadly, in the early years of our country, Vermont's landscape was drastically different.
I mean, it's just amazing. We look around now and Vermont's thought to be about 80% forested at this point. So 20% is open land. And then it was the exact opposite. 80% of these hills were bare.
The promise of plentiful resources and endless, unclaimed lands in the New World was enticing, and ships carried over many eager settlers to the shores of America. The brave and ambitious settlers set out exploring the lands and establishing towns.
So you have to think that people were coming up the Connecticut River in the mid-1600s.
Having before this little to no competition for land, beavers of pre-colonial Vermont were very different from the beavers of today.
Say in the late 1600s, early 1700s, gathered in much larger family groups than they do today, or extended family groups. So there would have been communities, you could call them. There might have been another word of, I don't know, 50 to 100 animals in one place, and they would have built dams that would have flooded whole valleys.
But due to the expanding villages, settlements, and farms of colonial Vermont, beavers were pitted against man for land.
And at that point, settlements had begun up and down the Connecticut rivers. A lot of towns like Putney were already established at that point. And the development was of rural farms, small farms. And what farmers had to do first, of course, was to clear the land. Now, a lot of that had already begun before the Revolution. And what that meant was cutting trees, of course, and the capital gain that came out of that was the potash, which was sold as a product because potash is used in making lye. So burning the trees, getting the ash, making potash, and sometimes you'll go around and you see Potash Road, and that's a reference back to something that was going on so many hundred years ago here, actually. It's really kind of interesting. At that point, of course, the state was mostly forested. And there was this terrific job in opening all the land so that it could be farmed. The next step in that was, for farmers here, was largely into sheep farming. Merinos were introduced by a governor of Vermont, and they were very popular in the early 1800s. That wasn't very sustainable, however. That's not something that kept on. And dairy was cows were the next kind of move onto the land, opening the land up for pasture and so on and so forth.
Having lost to an enemy much too powerful to ever overcome, beavers had to find a new way to survive.
The beaver were adapting, and the way they were adapting was by gathering in smaller and smaller groups and making smaller dams, which suggests to me a very intelligent animal.
However, merely adapting was not sufficient to save the beavers. European men's fashion during much of the 1700s and 1800s demanded that one wear a beaver pelt hat. This demand created a thriving
fur trade, and they were the easiest to trap because the trappers knew right where to go to trap them. They just had to look for a dam and some lodges, and their behavior was pretty predictable.
The first settlers were amazed by the vast lands and bountiful resources of Vermont, but because of their misuse, they were quickly exhausted.
So in the 1790s, the population was relatively high, and then it just began to drop as people moved west to farm into much easier farmland. And it kept dropping.
But the damage was already done.
Say the mid-1700s, and certainly by the time of the Revolution, beaver were pretty hard to come by, except in northern New England. And by 1850, by the middle of the next century, they were exterminated. They were returned to Vermont beginning in 1921, at least to southern Vermont, and so they were brought in by the Fish and Game.
And so well did the new beaver population take to the Vermont landscape that by 1940 they were well established. The beavers were brought in from upstate New York, so they are not true Vermont beavers. But that does not make the experience of seeing one in real life any less mystical, calming, or natural.
And I ball like you know I smoke that good. And I ball like now how you like me now?
Before one can fully understand why the beaver is so important to a forested ecosystem, one must know a bit of information about its diet.
Summer diet is largely aquatic plants that they get in their ponds. Wintertime, when things get a little harder, they depend more heavily on trees and tree bark in particular. They instinctively go after trees that have a lot of protein in their bark, willow, aspen, the kinds of trees that you find near water.
In order for the beaver to survive, it needed to evolve a special tool.
This actually is a genuine beaver skull. It's been beautifully cleaned, so it's nice and white and pretty. Beavers are rodents, much like mice and rats, and because they're rodents, they have very large incisors, these front teeth, like this, with this beautiful orange enamel on them. These incisor teeth are constantly growing, so they have to be constantly chewing. And what beavers are doing is they're constantly chewing on trees. They not only cut the trees down to make the dams, they actually eat the bark. So if you come into an area where beavers are living, you'll notice the gnaw marks all over the place. Not just on the trees that are in the dam itself, but if you look on the banks of the stream or the sides of the pond, you'll see all sorts of trees and all sorts of branches that have been gnawed right down where the beavers have been chewing on them. And they chew and they chew and they chew, and they just have to constantly chew because they not only need the nourishment, but they've got to keep their teeth whittled down like this.
Because the beavers change their surroundings to such a great extent, scientists have a term for them.
Beavers who live here in the Northeast are considered to be a keystone species. And by a keystone species, we mean a species that has an influence on its environment that's far out of proportion to its actual numbers in the environment. So there aren't that many beavers, but it affects a very large number of other species. Some ecologists say it affects as many as 50% of the other kinds of species in its environment.
The vehicle for this disproportional impact is simply the beaver dam.
What beavers do, of course, is they cut down trees and put them in a stream and make a dam, which creates a pond behind the dam. And in the process of building the dam, with the pond behind it, they create a whole ecosystem out in the forest. And so what that does is all sorts of creatures that normally wouldn't be able to live in a forest environment are able to live there because there's this pond. And in addition, the beavers move on. And when they're done with those areas, the pond will revert to a meadow. And so once the pond leaves, the dam will break and then the pond will go away, but then there will be a meadow. There will be a marsh and then a meadow, and all sorts of other creatures will be able to live in that open space.
Nature is not the only beneficiary of the beaver's work.
They also have a great deal of influence for humans, because when they dam up these streams, if those streams happen to be ones that have flood potential in the spring, from snow runoff and heavy rains, they actually mitigate the flood potential there by building the dams and then having the ponds back up. The streams will not flood downstream during high water times, and anybody who lives downstream will not experience the flood problems there. And also, if those areas are prone to any sort of drought, then having that pond back there actually helps mitigate the problems of drought, because it acts as a reservoir of fresh water that then will slowly be released, because the dams are not perfect, they are constantly releasing water, to slowly be released over time, and so the downstream environment will constantly get a supply of fresh water from that pond, where normally it might not if the pond hadn't been there in the first place.
Not everyone is eager to sing the beaver's praises. There are a number of valid complaints people have about beavers.
Well, some people consider beavers to be a nuisance in their environment. And part of that is simply because they do take the water that normally flows through a stream and back it up into a pond. Plus, it does flood an area of forest, and it takes away some of the forested area. And so if people are used to using that forest to, say, to log in some way, or take other resources out of the forest, it reduces the resources of the forest itself, because it opens the area up and there aren't as many trees.
Well, road washout is a big one for municipal officials. That can be a real problem. And for homeowners, just flooding fields, flooding backyards, endangering house sites, things like that. I'm waiting for one to break across from my house, and hoping that they've moved out. It's going to have to happen. I have had dreams where I've looked out the bedroom window in the morning and imagined that the whole hayfield was flooded. That they built a quarter-mile dam overnight, but so far they've just been dreams.
Although it is most improbable that his nightmare would ever come true, pond expansions and broken dams do pose serious problems.